come to speak today.
Oh, thank you. Great speaker. Wow. If that is true, thank you, David and Jess. I know you're probably watching from home, or I hope you're enjoying the rest today on a Sunday morning. Just a little bit about me. My name's Josh King. I have done ministry here in the greater Fort Wayne area for a while now with my beautiful wife, Kendall. So we've been doing this for about 5 years. I now work at NeighborLink Fort Wayne. That's also my family back there too as well, so they're amazing. They also have to put up with me. But yeah, we've been doing this for a long time. I say as I'm getting older, and I know a lot of you in here are like, well, you're not old, and I'm telling you, I feel old. When your students are starting to get married and going off to college, getting their master's degrees, you just start to see things a little bit differently. And one of the things that we've experienced is this idea of what it looks like for personal forgiveness, thus leading out to a greater forgiveness. Because as we're reading that text, and I'm going to be using the Message version a lot today because I love the Message, there's an interesting thing about forgiveness that I think Christians really struggle with. Obviously, people in general struggle with forgiveness. But I would say people of the way of Jesus, I would say we struggle even greatly with the idea of forgiveness. Because we are, unfortunately, sometimes addicted to the idea of retributive justice, right? It's this idea that you get what you're owed because that's fair and that's the way of the law, right? You get what you owed. You have to take the punishment, you have to take the crime, all these different things. And sometimes it even makes us feel better when people get what they deserve. I want to take a clip, if we had that clip, of one of my heroes who've passed away a little bit while ago, but Archbishop Desmond Tutu has a lot to say about forgiveness. And so I just want to watch this clip real quick.
What do you actually do when you forgive someone?
Well, basically, you're saying, I am abandoning my right to revenge, to pay back. By the fact that you have abused me, you have hurt me, or whatever it is that you have done, you have wronged me, by that you have given me a certain right, as it were, over you, that I could refuse to forgive you. I could say I have the right to retribution. When I forgive, I say I jettison that right, and I open the door of opportunity to you to make a new beginning. That is what I do when I forgive you.
The Buddhists talk of letting go of the past, dying to the past when you forgive, of letting loose of the sorrow that you have brought with you from the past. Is that what you're talking about?
The thing is, of course, that I don't know that you yourself are able, by an act of will, as it were, to let go of the pain. The will part of it, where you will, is deliberately to say, I am not going to let you victimize me and hold me in a position where I have an anger against you, a resentment, and I am looking for the opportunity to pay back. I am saying I want to let go of that right, and begin to work for the possibility of restoring the relationship.
Do I have to do anything, the person being forgiven?
For your own sake, the only way you can appropriate forgiveness is by confessing. That opens you. That opens you to the possibility of being able to receive it. It's like opening a window. You see, forgiveness can be likened to the fresh air that is outside or the sunlight that is outside, and you have a room and the windows are closed and the curtains are drawn. The wind is still out there. My forgiveness is still available to you, but it won't find access until you open the window and the light streams in. You draw the curtains apart and the fresh air comes in. You, by your contrition and confession, you say, I am sorry, forgive me. Open, and my forgiveness enters your being.
We're talking here about genocide, torture. Are genocide and torture forgivable?
As a Christian, you have to say, are there things that are unforgivable? I'm afraid we follow a Lord and Master who, at the point when they are crucifying him in the most painful way, can say, pray for their forgiveness. And we follow the one who says, forgive one another as God in Christ forgave you. That is, for us, the paradigm. We may not always reach to that ideal, but that is the standard.
What?
Yeah, so that is Desmond Tutu talking about forgiveness in the midst of coming out of one of the greatest catastrophes that have happened in human history. In South Africa, the apartheid. And if you don't know what the apartheid was, it was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa that lasted from 1948 to the early 1900s. Under this apartheid, the white minority government enforced policies that separated and severely restricted the rights of non-white majority, including their movement, employment, education, and political participation. It wasn't until 1994, Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years, just think about this, 27 years of your life as a political prisoner. He spends 27 of his years in prison. And so the first thing, when Nelson Mandela is also a huge hero of mine, and the first thing when I hear stories like this, it's just like, oh my gosh, wow, they are so much better than me. I could never get to this level and space of forgiveness, right? If someone cuts me off in the middle of the road, I'm ready to give them like an earful, right? This space of forgiveness, when we hear about it, like in this instance, where it's great and it's huge and it's impacted a lot of people, but within our personal selves and souls, it's like, I can never get to this place. Nelson Mandela has spent 27 years in prison. He came out, he was voted in, and he famously said this. This is one of my favorite quotes. As he's coming out of prison and he's elected, he could have took the retributive route, right? He could have forced his enemies into prison. He could have forced them into labor camps. He could have said, I have every right to do the exact same thing that you have done to me. Instead, he says this, and this is amazing. He says, as I walked out of the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I did not leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. As I walked out the door towards the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I did not leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I would still be in prison. He then later, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu and a few other leaders, they established the Establishment of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, and it was a huge step forward for victims that have been a part of the apartheid, who've been affected by the apartheid, could come and share their experiences about the wrongdoings in exchange for different things, for forgiveness, for love. There's moments where the prisoners and some of the people that had been affected by the prisoners came together and had discussions and quotes. This process emphasized the healing power of forgiveness on a national scale. So the big question, just if you could bear with me as you're thinking about things today, why do we struggle with unforgiveness? We're going to come back because we're going to talk about it later. I always do Q&R at the end. I don't have the answers, just responses. But why do we struggle with unforgiveness? If Jesus talks about it, and again, people are like, okay, well, Jesus was perfect. He was God in the flesh, He had to forgive, right? Sure. But if we call him, as Archbishop Tutu said, the Lord and Master and the way that we are supposed to lead, why are Christians known for their unforgiveness? Why are we known for wanting to get even in our retributive justice? We should be the first ones calling for restoration, reconciliation, and love and forgiveness, but we're not known for that. And so what do we do? What do we do when we struggle with this? So I want to start off by going to the Old Testament and then bringing us into the New. And I want to start off an example in the sacred text, starting with Jonah. Because Jonah is a very interesting case, okay? So if you've gone to Bible college and you've had to go and read and study this big book that's so complex and it's got these ancient Middle Eastern people who are trying to understand what it means to be human, you read the story of Jonah. If you take it literal, awesome, cool, go for it. The guy got swallowed up by a big fish, not a whale. That's all I tell people. It was a fish, not a whale. But it's interesting, the story of Jonah, because Jonah is told to go to Nineveh and preach the news against their wickedness. Now, for us, hindsight, we're like, oh yeah, Jonah, go ahead, do it. God commanded you to do that thing, you be obedient, whatever. But for us, that'd be like us going to North Korea with an American flag and say, hey, you know what, God came and visited me, and I need to tell you, hey, you guys are not doing so hot, so we're going to need you to, like, kind of stop, right? Like, we always say Jonah left because he was fearful for his life. But that's actually not true. Jonah wasn't afraid for his life. No. See, Jonah was scared because he was a prophet. And in those days, a prophet, that's a big deal, right? When you prophesy something from God and it doesn't go through, what does that make you look like? A fool. It makes you look like a fool. So then you kind of go and start to study like the history of Israel and the Assyrian Empire and what's happening here. Like, the Syrians were the bullies of Israel. They were brutal. They were at war. They're massacring some of these people. And so again, when you go and you understand the context here and understand what has happened in the story of Jonah, this is a little bit more complex than VeggieTales led us to believe, okay? Because one thing I always tell people, when you read Jonah, it is not a missionary tale. Everyone always says, I want to be a missionary like Jonah. I want to go to the places that are, like, it's not a missionary tale, okay? It's actually the furthest thing away from it. It's actually a cautionary tale. It's actually a cautionary tale. See, because this is the thing. I'll give you 4 things about Jonah, and I'll shut up. I won't. I'm going to keep going. But Jonah was not a missionary. Get that? Let's get that first. Matter of fact, he fled in the opposite direction. He's not a missionary. Okay? The only message Jonah preaches in the book, the only message, which God, we're going to read here in a second, in the beginning of Jonah preaches in the book, in his book, the coming destruction and not the actual call to repentance, no hope, no deliverance, no instruction about God. All he says is, and I'm going to read it to you, the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, Jonah began to go out into the city, go on a day's walk, and he cries out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. I always tell this to people because they always get confused. What was God's message to Jonah in the beginning? So we'll go to Jonah 1, and you read it. And this is the interesting thing that God told to Jonah. This is what he says. One day ago, God's word came to Jonah. Up on your feet and go to the city of Nineveh. Preach to them. They're in a bad way, and I cannot go at it any longer. I can't ignore it any longer. Jonah got up and went the opposite way. So the word of the Lord comes on to Jonah. He's told, hey, go tell them about their brokenness, their wickedness, which when he say that, people are like, oh, that's what our... No, God said, just go tell them about their extreme wickedness, which was violence. I tell people all the time, the extreme sin of Nineveh was their violence. They were violent to themselves and to others around them. And God says, I can't ignore it anymore. I need you to go and tell them what's going to happen. So Jonah said, nah, I'm going to go the other way. See, this is not a tale about God's destructive power, because later you go and read in Jonah 4, what we just read earlier. He's disappointed and angry when the people of Nineveh respond favorably. He's actually upset. So when you go and just follow along with me here in Jonah 4, I think it's always fascinating because I think this tells us more about ourselves and our condition more than we like to admit. So this is the thing, and I always say Jonah's the biggest emo kid I've ever met in my life. He had a little bit of anger issues, but it's interesting. He says this. This is Jonah 4. He preached the message. He goes outside the city. He's ticked. He goes and says this. Jonah was furious. He lost his temper. He yelled at God. God, I knew it when I was back at home. This is the most important thing. I knew it when I was back at home. I knew this was going to happen. That's why I went off to Tarshish. I knew you were sheer grace, mercy, not easily angered, rich in love, and ready at the drop of the hat to turn your plans of punishment into a plan of forgiveness. So Jonah didn't run because he was scared. Jonah didn't run because he was fear of his life. Jonah didn't run. He ran because God used a plan of reconciliation and restorative justice. He didn't destroy them. And if you really think about it, if God is all powerful, all knowing, he sees what's going to happen. He knows what's going to happen. Jonah's like, okay, I know the guy that you are, and this is what's going to happen if they turn to you. You keep reading. This was interesting. So this just shows you the heart of Jonah, and I think it even shows us the heart of us. So God, if you won't kill them, kill me off instead. I'm better off dead. Talk about dramatic, right? God said to Jonah, yo, man, what do you have to be so angry about? Why are you upset? And again, this is why I love the text, because you have this dialogue between God and Jonah that we get the privilege of seeing. And we're seeing this question. Of course, God knows why Jonah's angry. But they're talking it out. They're discussing it. Because I think we serve a God, again, who's not afraid of our own anger or our questions or our unforgiveness. He meets us in that as well. God said, what do you have to be angry about? Jonah then just left. He went out of the city to the east and sat down in a sulk. He put together a makeshift shelter of leafy branches and sat there in the shade to see what would happen to the city. So even when God relented, he was still a hope of being like, well, maybe God will change his mind and destroy the city. Maybe God will change his mind, and or maybe someone drop over dead. Who knows? Like, I want to see at least something happen. So then God doesn't say anything else. he arranges for this leaf tree to spring up, and it grows over Jonah, and it cools him off, right? Because sometimes when we get a little hot, we get a little heated, we just need to cool off. Some of us need to take a nap. He put this tree over him. Jonah was pleased and enjoyed the shade. And then this is what it says: life was looking up. So Jonah, when he receives this beautiful shade, it's beautiful, life's looking up. It's good, I feel great. But then the next day, God sent a worm. And by dawn of the next day, this worm was obviously hungry and had bored its way into the tree. And the tree withered away. The sun came down, sent a hot, blistering wind from the east. The sun beat down on Jonah's head, and he's starting to faint. This is the thing. So then when things start going bad again, Jonah's like, God, just take me out. I'm ready to die right now. Jonah's a little conflicted within his own life, yeah. Then Jonah said to God again, what right do you have to get angry about this shade tree? And this is why I love the text. Even if there's a whole thing about the scriptures and people don't really understand it, you have to take the time to really read it and try to understand what it's trying, the wisdom that's trying to be pulled out of it. People use the scriptures for all types of different things, but the wisdom that's being pulled out is interesting. God said this to Jonah: what right do you have to get angry about this shade tree? Jonah said, like many of us would say, plenty. I have so many reasons to get upset. It's made me so angry, I want to die. Again, dramatic. God says this. What's this? How is it you can change your feelings from pleasure to anger overnight about a mere shade tree that you did nothing to get? That's the question. How can your whole attitude change overnight about something that you didn't even do or create? You neither planted it nor watered it. It grew up one night and died the next. So this is what this, I love this. This is what it says. So why, likewise, I can change what I feel about Nineveh from anger to pleasure. This big city of more than 120,000 childlike people who do not yet know right from wrong, to say nothing of all the innocent animals. Even God cares about the animals there. What I'm telling you about this story is, and it's wild when you really think about it, we are so addicted to retributive justice. We're so addicted to it. Americans, I think especially as Americans, we feel as if, and I remember this, I remember vividly during 9/11 when the towers were struck and we were going to war, and I remember people cheering out to say, we need to go over there and bomb them. Let's bomb them to hell. That's literally what people talked about. I remember watching WWE one day, and don't judge me, but I remember John Cena and WWE, which is the craziest thing to think about, that John Cena is delivering the news that we got Osama bin Laden, and he's delivering the fact that we got him and we killed him, which is crazy to think about. That's the first I heard about Osama bin Laden die. And we cheered. We cheered about the death of an image bearer of God, who has done heinous things. Don't get me wrong. The Ninevites did heinous things. The South American government during the apartheid did heinous things. But God has taught us to forgive. See, this is the thing. Unforgiveness, and we see this played out in Jonah, research tells us that it literally helps us down the line. The psychologist Fred Lungson said this. It says, in careful scientific studies, forgiveness training has been shown to reduce depression, increase hopefulness, decrease anger, improve spiritual connection, and increase emotional self-confidence. These are some of the real and concrete psychological benefits. Research also shows that people who are more forgiving report fewer health and mental problems and fewer symptoms of stress. Medical and psychological studies have also shown that a person holding on to anger and resentment is at an increased risk for anxiety, depression, insomnia, and is more likely to suffer from high blood pressure, ulcers, migraines, backaches, heart attacks, and even cancer. The reverse is also true. Genuine forgiveness can transform these ailments. When stress, anxiety, and depression are reduced, so are the accompanying physical disorders. See, because our bodies were not created to hold on to these things. Our bodies were not created to hold on to bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness. Our bodies were created to relinquish that and give that over to something that is greater than ourselves. This is why spirituality, religion, connection, whatever it is helpful and beneficial for us, because it gives us a form of what? We relinquish control. Jonah had no control. That really makes us mad as human beings. When we do not have full control, it makes us mad. So, what do we do with this? What do we do when we're looking at this? Because people say, okay, Josh, that's really good. That's beautiful, blah, 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 flowers and rainbows. But forgiveness is hard. And I want to give you just a few things to understand that I want you to hear clear, because I don't want you to hear coming out here saying, well, Josh told us that it's just fine and people commit genocide is fine and da-da-da-da-da, and my abuse, no, that's not what I'm saying. There's a key to understand what forgiveness really means and what it looks like and what it's not, okay? So I'm going to give you a few quick things, okay? Forgiveness is not easy. Duh. Forgiveness is not easy. It requires hard work and consistent willingness. It is an everyday choice to forgive. Just like it's an everyday choice to love your spouse, your partner, whomever, it is a willingness and consistent willingness to forgive. I have to choose to forgive. It doesn't just magically come upon us, even when you're speaking to God like Jonah. It doesn't just magically come upon you. You have to make the choice. Forgiveness is not weakness. Everyone says that forgiving is weak. It is not. It requires courage and strength. I would say even greater than holding on. It's easy to hold on to unforgiveness, but for forgiveness to face that, it requires courage and strength. Forgiveness does not subvert justice. Let me say that one more time, because for all my justice warriors in here, forgiveness does not subvert it, but it creates space for justice to be enacted with the purity of purpose that does not include revenge. I want to say that one more time. It creates space for true justice to be enacted with purity of purpose that does not include revenge. Why do you think Paul tells us that vengeance is not ours, but it belongs to who? The Lord. Because he sees things fully that which we cannot. God sees the greater picture. We see a limited scope. So when people say, well, God will still have his vengeance, I don't think you're reading the scriptures fully again. Because after that, what does Paul say? He says, what? If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he needs clothes, clothe him. Vengeance is not ours. It is the Lord's. And his vengeance is not punitive. It's not trying to crush. It is to restore. The text tells us that God, in the end, will be all in all. He will be all in all. His justice is pure, but it's not for the point of revenge. This is another thing. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It requires a fearless remembering of hurt. Let me say that one more time. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It requires a fearless remembering of the hurt. I always say this when Jesus is on the cross and he's dying. He calls out what exactly is happening to them. He says, Lord, forgive them. They do not know what they do. He's not forgetting. Hey, I'm still up here. I'm still dying. He's pointing it out. And then later you see when Peter goes and talks to the high council, what does he tell them in Acts? You killed the author of life. It doesn't mean we forget what happens. It doesn't mean that we just brush it off. No, we still remember it. But this is the thing. Forgiveness is not quick. Hear me out. And this is the most empathetic place that we have to be. Forgiveness is not quick. It can take several journeys through the cycles of remembering and grief before one can truly forgive and be free. We have to understand that. I'm going to go through these real quick. Forgiveness is beneficial for our health. Forgiveness is beneficial for our health. Forgiveness offers freedom from the past, from a perpetrator, from future victimization. Forgiveness heals families and communities. Guys, think about it. We just had a young man who was shot and killed by the police. And me and a couple of other people worked tirelessly and together to make sure that we preached a message of reconciliation and nonviolence. Because what happens when people get angry? They retaliate. And we say, no, that's not the way of Jesus. We want justice, but justice that makes room for forgiveness. Forgiveness heals families and communities. We forgive so we don't suffer physically or mentally the coercive effects of holding on to anger and resentment. This is the thing, guys, we're all interconnected. Forgiveness helps us because we're all interconnected and we have a shared humanity. Forgiveness is a gift we give to ourselves. It is a gift you give to yourself. This is the thing. I love it because there's this quote from one of my favorite church fathers. He says this: God forgives unconditionally, so can we. The thief on the cross still dies on his cross, but forgiveness will set his spirit free. Say it one more time. God forgives unconditionally, so can we. The thief on the cross still dies on the cross. There's still the reality of what's happening. There's still accountability. There's still things that happen. But forgiveness set his spirit free. I love this again in Matthew 6:14-15. In prayer, there's a connection between what God does. This is after the Lord's Prayer, right? The famous thing we always talk about and we say, there's right after it says, in prayer, there's a connection between what God does and what you do. It's a participation. You are participating in what God is doing in the universe. You can't get forgiveness from God, not that God is withholding it. That's when people read this, like, oh, God's withholding forgiveness if I don't forgive. That's not what's happening. You can't get forgiveness. You can't understand forgiveness. You can't receive forgiveness from God, for instance, without also forgiving others. As Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, it's like being in a room. The forgiveness is out there, but you're locked up in your own room. If you refuse to do your part, you cut yourself off from God's part. Last thing, and this is the beautiful thing that Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter, they created this 4 paths of forgiveness. It's this fourfold path of forgiveness. It's a framework designed to guide individuals through the process of forgiving others. I use this a ton with students, with people who are hurt in the community. Like, when we talk about forgiveness, this is what we talk about. This is what we guide them through. So, real quick, tell the story. You got to tell your story. Don't hold on to it. Share it with someone, a professional, a pastor, a psychologist, whoever. You have to tell the story. This involves recounting the details of what happened. It's important to articulate the facts, clearly expressing the emotions and the impact of the event. This step is about facing the reality of the situation and acknowledging the hurt that it's caused. You have to share what happened. You have to acknowledge that it happened. Second thing, name the hurt. In this step, you identify and articulate the specific emotions you feel as a result of this event. So let me just say this real quick. It takes a lot of emotional maturity to do this. That's a whole nother message. But it takes a lot of emotional maturity to be able to do this. Because as a guy, and especially for me, most of the time when someone does hurt me, I'd kind of like, that's fine, I'll get over it. Later down the line, I'm still mad at what happened. Ask my wife, she'll tell you. But in this step, you have to identify and articulate the specific emotions you feel as a result of the event. This might include feelings of anger, sadness, betrayal, and fear. Recognizing and naming these emotions is crucial for processing them and understanding the depth of impact. Last two things. Grant forgiveness. Granting forgiveness means making a conscious decision to let it go. You're making the conscious decision of letting go of the resentment and thoughts of revenge. It does not mean forgetting or condoning the actions. I have to tell people all the time, you don't just condone it. You don't just forget about it. But you let go of the feelings and the thoughts of resentment and revenge. It involves releasing the hold the event has over you. And this step, out of all of them, is the most difficult and the most challenging because it requires a deep commitment to move beyond the pain. This is the hardest step out of all three. You have to make the commitment, the choice to say, I will not let this hold over me any longer. Last thing, renew or release the relationship. Get what I said? Renew or release the relationship. The final step involves deciding the future relationship with the person who hurt you. Renewing the relationship means working towards reconciliation and rebuilding trust. Trust was broken, hurt happened. You have to decide if it's worth it to build that back up. But there's also another option, and people always say, this is harsh, but this is the truth. Sometimes you have to release the relationship. You have to let it go. It means choosing to move on without maintaining a close connection. And this step emphasizes the importance of moving forward in a way that promotes both parties' well-being and peace of mind. You got to decide to let that go. I want to leave you guys with just one more beautiful story of forgiveness. And we all know what's happening in the midst of Israel and Palestine and all that stuff. And everyone's got an opinion, and I have my own. But this has been going on for a while, not just in 2024. It seems like everyone just caught on to it recently for reasons. But this has been going on for a long time. And there's this interesting story about a man named Bassem Arim. At the age of 12, he watched as another boy, his age, was shot and killed by an Israeli soldier. So at the age of 12, he had the most traumatic event of his life. He was killed. Bassem is Palestinian, and he saw another kid his age shot and killed by an Israeli soldier. In that moment, he felt a deep need for revenge and joined a group of freedom fighters. Some called him a terrorist, but he felt he was fighting for his safety, his home, and his right to be free. At 17, he was caught planning an attack on Israeli troops and sentenced to 7 years in prison. 7 years in prison. Sound familiar, yeah? In prison, he only learned to hate more as he was stripped naked, beaten by his prison guards. He says this, they were beating us without hatred because for them this was just a training exercise and they just saw us as objects. Completely stripped of his humanity, his identity. While in prison, Bassem engaged in a dialogue with his Israeli guard, and over time each thought that the other was the terrorist, and each equally denied being the settler in the land that they shared. And through their conversations, they realized how much more they had in common, deeper shared humanity with one another. For Bassem, it was the first time he says recalling feeling empathy for his guard's life. This is the first time he's like, I've ever felt empathy for my guard's life. Seeing the transformation that took place between him and his captor as they recognized their shared humanity, Bassem realized that violence could never bring peace, and this realization changed his life. He was released from prison. In 2005, he co-founded a group called Combat for Peace. And even to this day, he has still not picked up a weapon. And for him, this was not a sign of weakness, but of true strength. But this is the crazy thing. In 2007, his 10-year-old daughter was shot and killed by an Israeli soldier as he stood outside her school. Again, experiencing the same pain and resentment. But this is the beauty of shared humanity and connection. See, because God's love transcends all over religions. It transcends. People get weird about that, but I'm telling you the truth. When you hear these stories, when you sit down with people, God's love and forgiveness transcends religions, ideologies. This is what he said. Aubrey's, his daughter's murder could have led me down this easy path of hatred and vengeance, but for me, there was no return from dialogue and of non-violence. It could have led me down this easy path of hatred and vengeance, but for me, there is no return from dialogue and non-violence. After all, that's what he says. After all, it was one Israeli soldier who shot my daughter, but 100 former Israeli soldiers who built a garden in her name at the school in which she was murdered. He says this, I say again, forgiveness is not weakness. You guys pray with me real quick. Lord, we thank you just for this time. In the midst of just craziness, political, civil, racial injustice and unrest, for the people of the way, we are called into deep, deep love and forgiveness and grace as you have shown us on the cross. As you were taking your last breath, you asked, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And I ask, Lord, that as we leave here, we would be beacons and embody this love and forgiveness that we've been shown. We love our neighbors, no matter who they are, as ourselves. And so we just thank you for this time. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.